The Hungarian Revolution of 1956 emerged from a convergence of post-war disillusionment, ideological rigidity, and national trauma that had been simmering beneath the surface of Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe for more than a decade, as Hungary struggled to reconcile its historical identity with the realities imposed by Stalinist domination after the Second World War. Following the defeat of Nazi Germany, Hungary found itself drawn into the Soviet sphere of influence, not through popular choice, but through occupation and political engineering, as the Red Army's presence enabled the gradual consolidation of communist power under Matyas Rákosi, a hardline leader who modeled his rule explicitly on Stalin's methods, embracing purges, show trials, forced collectivization, and a pervasive security apparatus that penetrated every level of society. The promise of socialist reconstruction quickly gave way to fear and scarcity. As industrial targets were prioritized over consumer needs, agriculture was disrupted by coercive policies, and political dissent was criminalized, leaving a population exhausted by war, now subjected to a new form of repression that claimed ideological necessity as its justification. Hungary's experience was shaped not only by economic hardship, but by a deep sense of national humiliation, rooted in the legacy of the Treaty of Trianon, which had dismembered the country after the First World War, and now compounded by the reality that sovereignty had been effectively surrendered to a foreign power, whose language, culture, and priorities felt alien. This resentment did not immediately translate into open resistance, as the memory of wartime devastation and the overwhelming presence of Soviet power discouraged confrontation, but it lingered in private conversations, cultural memory, and a growing awareness that the promises of socialism bore little resemblance to lived reality. The death of Joseph Stalin in 1953 introduced a measure of uncertainty into this rigid system, as Moscow's grip appeared to loosen slightly and reformist currents began to surface across the Eastern Bloc, creating cautious hope that the worst excesses of terror might be curtailed. In Hungary, this shift led to the brief elevation of Imre Nagy, a reform-minded communist who advocated for a new course that emphasized economic relief, reduced repression, and limited political liberalization, policies that resonated with a population desperate for change, but alarmed hardliners who feared the erosion of party control. Nagy's tenure was short-lived, as Rákosi and his allies maneuvered to remove him, reasserting orthodoxy and signaling that reform would not be tolerated beyond narrow limits, a reversal that deepened cynicism and reinforced the sense that meaningful change could not be achieved through internal adjustment alone. The broader significance of these developments lay in how they interacted with shifts in Soviet ideology itself, particularly after Nikita Khrushchev's secret speech at the 20th Party Congress in February 1956, where he denounced Stalin's cult of personality and acknowledged past crimes, a revelation that reverberated throughout the socialist world, undermining the moral authority of regimes built in Stalin's image, and emboldening critics who now believed that reform was not only necessary, but sanctioned from above. In Hungary, the impact of this speech was electric, as intellectuals, students, and party members alike began to debate the legitimacy of existing leadership, questioning whether loyalty to socialism required obedience to discredited methods and leaders. Writers' unions and discussion circles became centers of increasingly bold criticism, calling for political pluralism, freedom of expression, and national independence. Demands that reflected not a rejection of socialism per se, but a desire to reclaim it from bureaucratic distortion. These debates unfolded against a backdrop of mounting economic frustration, as shortages persisted, living standards stagnated, and the gap between official propaganda and daily experience grew impossible to ignore. By the autumn of 1956, Hungary was a society on edge, animated by a sense that history was moving and that opportunities for change, long denied, might finally be within reach. The catalyst for open revolt came from outside Hungary's borders, as events in neighboring Poland demonstrated that mass pressure could force concessions from Moscow, inspiring Hungarian students to organize demonstrations in solidarity and to articulate their own demands for reform. On October 23, 1956, a peaceful student march in Budapest quickly swelled into a mass demonstration, as workers, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens joined in, carrying national flags with the communist emblem cut out, a powerful symbol of rejection, not of the nation, but of imposed ideology. The atmosphere was charged but hopeful, as protesters called for the return of Imre Nagy, the withdrawal of Soviet troops, free elections, and freedom of speech, demands that echoed across the city and exposed the fragility of a regime that had relied on fear rather than consent. The response of the authorities was hesitant and confused, reflecting divisions within the party and uncertainty about Moscow's intentions. And when security forces opened fire on demonstrators near the radio building, killing unarmed civilians, the confrontation crossed a point of no return. Outrage spread rapidly, transforming protest into insurrection as weapons were seized, barricades erected, and revolutionary councils formed, drawing in soldiers who defected rather than fire on their compatriots. Within hours, Budapest was engulfed in fighting, as armed citizens confronted the symbols of state power and challenged a regime that only days earlier had seemed immovable. The initial Soviet response was equally uncertain, as Red Army units already stationed in Hungary moved to restore order, only to encounter fierce resistance and a population united by a sudden, electrifying sense of possibility. What began as a demand for reform had become a national uprising, fueled by years of repression, sharpened by ideological disillusionment, and propelled by the belief that the moment for reclaiming Hungary's future had finally arrived, setting the stage for one of the most dramatic and consequential confrontations of the Cold War. As fighting spread across Budapest and into provincial cities, the Hungarian Revolution rapidly evolved from a spontaneous uprising into a full-scale national revolt that exposed the depth of popular opposition to Soviet domination and the fragility of communist control when fear receded, as workers formed revolutionary councils, police units collapsed, and elements of the Hungarian army either defected or stood aside, unwilling to suppress a movement that now openly claimed to represent the nation itself. The speed of this transformation shocked both Hungarian party officials and Soviet commanders, who had underestimated the extent to which resentment toward the regime had permeated society, and who now faced an adversary that lacked centralized command, but possessed overwhelming moral legitimacy and intimate knowledge of urban terrain. Street battles raged as improvised militias armed with captured weapons and Molotov cocktails confronted Soviet tanks in narrow streets, exploiting the city's layout to neutralize armored advantages and inflicting unexpected losses that further demoralized occupying forces. Radio broadcasts and leaflets carried revolutionary messages nationwide, calling for unity, independence, and the withdrawal of Soviet troops, while reports of successful resistance inspired parallel uprisings in other cities, confirming that the revolt was not confined to Budapest, but reflected a broader national awakening. Faced with escalating violence and the risk of uncontrollable collapse, the Hungarian Communist Party turned once again to Imre Nagy, reinstating him as prime minister in a desperate attempt to regain legitimacy and channel the uprising into a political process. Nagy moved quickly to distance himself from the discredited Rákosi system, announcing the dissolution of the secret police, promising free elections, and signaling an end to one-party rule, measures that electrified the population and suggested that the revolution's goals might be achieved without further bloodshed. Most dramatically, Nagy declared Hungary's intention to withdraw from the Warsaw Pact and adopt a position of neutrality, a step that transformed the crisis from a domestic rebellion into a direct challenge to the post-war security order of Eastern Europe. For many Hungarians, this declaration represented the fulfillment of long-suppressed aspirations for sovereignty and dignity, while for Soviet leaders it constituted an intolerable threat that risked unraveling the entire Eastern Bloc by establishing a precedent for successful defection. The initial Soviet reaction to these developments appeared ambiguous, as Moscow announced a willingness to withdraw troops and entered into negotiations, prompting widespread hope that the revolution might succeed and that Hungary could chart an independent course. Soviet units began to pull back from Budapest, and for a brief, fragile moment, the city experienced an extraordinary calm. As barricades were dismantled, revolutionary councils took control of workplaces, and citizens dared to believe that the sacrifices of the preceding days had secured genuine freedom. This interlude, however, concealed intense debate within the Kremlin, where the leadership confronted a stark choice between accommodation and force, weighing the ideological, strategic, and psychological consequences of allowing a socialist state to leave the Soviet orbit. The broader Cold War context weighed heavily on these deliberations, as leaders feared that a neutral Hungary would encourage similar movements in East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and beyond, undermining the credibility of Soviet power and threatening the security buffer that had been built at enormous cost after the Second World War. While some voices argued for restraint, warning that renewed intervention would provoke international condemnation and deepen divisions, hardliners prevailed, convinced that the survival of the socialist system and the authority of the Soviet Union depended on decisive action. Preparations for a massive military response were set in motion under strict secrecy, even as diplomatic signals continued to suggest compromise, creating a fatal gap between Hungarian expectations and Soviet intentions. Within Hungary, revolutionary leaders struggled to consolidate authority and establish order, hampered by limited resources, internal disagreements, and the sheer speed with which events were unfolding, while ordinary citizens attempted to resume daily life amid uncertainty, unaware that the apparent withdrawal of Soviet forces masked a far larger buildup just beyond the borders. The revolution's lack of centralized leadership and external support left it vulnerable to reversal, as appeals for international assistance went unanswered, constrained by Western reluctance to risk direct confrontation with the Soviet Union and distracted by the simultaneous Suez Crisis, which diverted global attention and underscored the limits of Western intervention. As days passed and no concrete guarantees materialized, the sense of hope began to mingle with unease, as rumors of renewed Soviet movements circulated and the reality of Hungary's isolation became increasingly apparent. Nonetheless, the belief persisted that the world would not permit the violent suppression of a popular uprising, a belief grounded more in moral expectation than in geopolitical calculation, and one that would soon be shattered with devastating force. The Hungarian Revolution stood at a critical juncture, having achieved extraordinary gains in a matter of days, yet poised on the brink of catastrophe as the balance of power shifted decisively against it, revealing how quickly the momentum of liberation could collide with the brutal logic of Cold War strategy. The decisive blow to the Hungarian Revolution came in the early hours of November 4th, 1956, when the Soviet Union launched a massive, coordinated military operation to crush the uprising. Abandoning any pretense of compromise and asserting by force the limits of permissible change within its sphere of influence, as thousands of tanks and tens of thousands of troops poured into Hungary from multiple directions under the command of seasoned generals determined to restore control at any cost. Budapest awoke to the sound of artillery and armor as Soviet units encircled the capital, targeting key intersections, communication centers, and government buildings in an assault designed to overwhelm resistance through sheer scale and firepower, leaving little doubt that the intervention was final and uncompromising. Imre Nagy addressed the nation in a brief, desperate radio broadcast, announcing that Hungary was under attack and appealing to the world for help, words that would become emblematic of the revolution's isolation as no assistance arrived, and the broadcast was soon silenced. Resistance fighters, despite being outgunned and outnumbered, mounted fierce defenses in working-class districts and along narrow streets where urban terrain offered limited protection, using improvised weapons and intimate knowledge of the city to slow Soviet advances and inflict casualties. But the disparity in force was overwhelming, and casualties mounted rapidly on both sides. Soviet commanders employed tactics refined in earlier conflicts, isolating neighborhoods, cutting off supplies, and using armor and infantry in close coordination to eliminate pockets of resistance, while air power and artillery compounded the devastation, turning residential areas into battlefields and accelerating civilian suffering. The brutality of the assault shocked observers and participants alike, as hospitals overflowed, infrastructure collapsed, and thousands were killed or wounded in a matter of days, underscoring the human cost of enforcing geopolitical order. Outside Budapest, resistance flared briefly in other cities and towns, but the speed and scale of the Soviet offensive made sustained opposition impossible, and by mid-November, organized fighting had largely ceased, replaced by sporadic acts of defiance that were swiftly suppressed. In the wake of the invasion, a new government headed by János Kadar was installed under Soviet protection, presenting itself as a restoration of socialist order while denouncing the revolution as counter-revolutionary, a narrative that sought to legitimize repression and erase the popular origins of the uprising. Imre Nagy sought refuge in the Yugoslav embassy, where he was later deceived into leaving under promises of safe conduct, only to be arrested, tried in secret, and eventually executed, a fate that symbolized the ruthless determination to eliminate any alternative source of authority or legitimacy. Repression followed swiftly and systematically as thousands were arrested, imprisoned, or executed. Revolutionary councils were dissolved, and the security apparatus was rebuilt with renewed vigor, ensuring that the memory of resistance would be driven underground. An estimated 200,000 Hungarians fled the country in the weeks following the invasion, crossing into Austria and other neighboring states in one of the largest refugee movements in post-war Europe, carrying with them stories of resistance and betrayal that would shape international perceptions of Soviet power. The international response was marked by condemnation, but constrained by Cold War realities, as Western governments denounced the invasion yet took no direct action, their options limited by the risk of nuclear escalation and the competing crisis unfolding in Suez, a juxtaposition that revealed the moral compromises embedded in global power politics. Within the socialist world, the invasion sent a chilling message, demonstrating unequivocally that national sovereignty and reformist aspirations would be subordinated to the strategic imperatives of bloc cohesion, reinforcing a climate of caution and conformity that would persist for years. The crushing of the Hungarian Revolution thus represented a decisive assertion of control, restoring order through force while extinguishing the illusion that meaningful independence could be achieved within the existing Cold War framework. Yet even as the tanks withdrew and a semblance of stability returned, the cost of intervention lingered, as the legitimacy of communist rule was irreparably damaged in the eyes of many, both within Hungary and beyond. The events of November 1956 exposed the underlying contradiction of Soviet authority, that it rested not on consent or ideological conviction, but on the readiness to deploy overwhelming violence when challenged, a reality that would shape Eastern European politics and Cold War perceptions for decades to come. The revolution had been defeated militarily, but its moral impact could not be so easily erased, as the memory of popular resistance and the spectacle of repression became enduring symbols of the limits of power and the fragility of imposed order in a divided Europe. In the immediate aftermath of the Soviet invasion, Hungary entered a grim period of consolidation and reckoning, as the revolutionary fervor of October gave way to fear, exhaustion, and the systematic reimposition of control under the newly installed Kadar government, whose authority rested not on popular consent, but on the visible presence of Soviet power and the implicit threat of renewed violence. The regime moved quickly to dismantle the remnants of the revolution, dissolving workers' councils, disarming civilian militias, and purging institutions of anyone suspected of sympathy with the uprising, while the security services, reconstituted and empowered, conducted widespread arrests aimed at extinguishing even the possibility of organized resistance. Trials were held behind closed doors, sentences were harsh, and executions were carried out in secrecy, creating an atmosphere in which silence became a survival strategy and political expression retreated once more into the private sphere. Yet repression alone could not stabilize the country indefinitely, and Kadar, acutely aware of the fragility of his position, gradually adopted a strategy that combined coercion with limited concessions, seeking to restore a degree of normalcy by easing the most onerous aspects of Stalinist rule once control had been firmly reasserted. Over time, this approach produced a cautious social contract, in which political obedience was exchanged for relative economic stability and personal security, a pragmatic arrangement that would later be described as goulash communism, reflecting its emphasis on consumer welfare over ideological zeal. This accommodation did not erase the trauma of 1956, but it did reduce the likelihood of renewed uprising by lowering the daily costs of compliance and offering a semblance of predictability after months of chaos and bloodshed. Internationally, the Hungarian Revolution and its suppression reverberated far beyond the country's borders, profoundly shaping perceptions of the Soviet Union and the moral landscape of the Cold War, as images of tanks in Budapest and refugees streaming westward undermined claims that communist regimes represented voluntary expressions of popular will. Western communist parties were thrown into crisis as many members recoiled from the invasion and questioned their allegiance to Moscow, accelerating ideological fragmentation that weakened Soviet influence within the global left. For Western governments, Hungary became a sobering lesson in the limits of intervention, reinforcing a cautious approach to Eastern Europe that prioritized stability over liberation and acknowledged, however reluctantly, the realities of superpower spheres of influence. Within the Eastern Bloc, the message was unmistakable, as the events of 1956 demonstrated that challenges to party authority would be met with overwhelming force, discouraging reformist experimentation and fostering a climate of conformity that would persist until the late Cold War. The psychological impact of the revolution was particularly enduring, as the brief experience of freedom heightened awareness of what had been lost, embedding a quiet skepticism toward official ideology that survived beneath outward compliance and resurfaced in later decades. For many Hungarians, 1956 became a defining reference point, shaping personal identities and collective memory even as public discussion was suppressed, its legacy preserved in exile communities, private narratives, and cultural expression rather than official history. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, absorbed the lessons of Hungary into a doctrine that prioritized bloc unity over national autonomy, reinforcing a pattern of intervention that would be invoked again in Czechoslovakia in 1968, and cementing a strategic culture that equated reform with risk. The cost of this approach was not immediately apparent, as order was restored and stability maintained, but it planted the seeds of long-term legitimacy loss, as the gap between proclaimed ideals and enforced reality widened with each intervention. The Hungarian Revolution thus assumed a paradoxical role in Cold War history, appearing at once as a defeated revolt and as a moral victory that exposed the contradictions of imposed power, inspiring later generations, even as it warned them of the dangers inherent in direct confrontation. By demonstrating both the possibility of mass resistance and the brutality of its suppression, 1956 shaped the strategies of dissidents and reformers who would seek change through more gradual, negotiated means, learning from Hungary's sacrifice while refusing to forget its example. In this way, the revolution's significance extended beyond its immediate failure, influencing the trajectory of Eastern Europe and the Cold War itself by revealing the true boundaries of power, the price of defiance, and the enduring human desire for autonomy in a system built on control. The broader legacy of the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 unfolded slowly over the decades that followed, as its suppression shaped the political imagination of Eastern Europe and altered the strategic assumptions of the Cold War, revealing that stability enforced through fear could endure for a time, but would ultimately hollow out the systems it sustained. In Hungary itself, the memory of 1956 became a suppressed but powerful undercurrent, shaping attitudes toward authority and fostering a cautious pragmatism in which overt rebellion was avoided, but belief in official ideology steadily eroded, creating a society that complied outwardly while withdrawing inwardly. This erosion of conviction proved more damaging in the long run than open dissent, as it deprived the regime of genuine legitimacy and reduced politics to a transactional exchange rather than a shared project, a condition that would later facilitate peaceful transition when external constraints loosened. Across the Eastern Bloc, the lessons of Hungary were internalized by both rulers and ruled, discouraging mass uprisings while encouraging subtler forms of resistance centered on culture, memory, and moral authority, strategies that acknowledged the overwhelming power of the state while seeking to undermine it through endurance rather than confrontation. For Soviet leaders, the intervention reinforced the belief that force could preserve order, but also heightened awareness of the risks inherent in ruling through coercion, contributing to a strategic conservatism that favored containment of dissent over experimentation, a posture that limited adaptability and deepened systemic stagnation. Internationally, the revolution left a lasting imprint on Western policy, tempering rhetoric about liberation with an acceptance of spheres of influence and reinforcing a preference for gradual engagement and arms control over direct challenges to Soviet control in Eastern Europe. The juxtaposition of Hungary with the Suez Crisis further underscored the moral ambiguities of Cold War power politics, as competing interventions exposed the selective application of principles and the extent to which strategic interests shaped responses to popular movements. For exiles and émigré communities, 1956 became a defining identity, a symbol of resistance that sustained cultural memory and transmitted narratives of defiance to subsequent generations, ensuring that the revolution's significance was preserved even as it was silenced at home. Within Hungary, this memory resurfaced cautiously in later years, informing reformist debates and shaping the language of change as leaders and intellectuals sought to reconcile national dignity with geopolitical reality. When the Cold War began to unravel in the late 1980s, the events of 1956 were reevaluated openly, reclaimed as a foundational moment of national resistance and moral clarity, and recognized as an early warning of the contradictions that would eventually undo Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe. The peaceful transition that followed in 1989 did not negate the tragedy of the revolution's suppression, but it did vindicate its underlying aspirations, demonstrating that the desire for sovereignty and pluralism could be deferred but not extinguished. In this sense, the Hungarian Revolution stands as both a cautionary tale and a source of continuity, illustrating how the failure of one generation can shape the strategies and successes of another, and how memory can serve as a quiet form of resistance within constrained systems. The Cold War's end revealed the full weight of 1956's legacy, as regimes once stabilized by fear collapsed with remarkable speed when external enforcement receded, confirming that control imposed by force lacked durability in the absence of consent. The revolution's final significance, therefore, lies not only in the courage of those who rose and the brutality of their defeat, but in the clarity it brought to the nature of power in the Cold War, exposing the limits of coercion and the enduring strength of collective aspiration. The Hungarian Revolution of 1956 remains one of the most poignant episodes of the 20th century, a moment when a nation confronted empire, paid a devastating price, and nonetheless altered the course of history by revealing truths that would echo long after the tanks had rolled away. The final reckoning of the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 lies in the way it transformed defeat into a lasting moral indictment of Cold War power, as an uprising that failed militarily succeeded in exposing the fundamental contradiction at the heart of Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe. That authority rested not on consent or ideological conviction, but on the willingness to deploy overwhelming force against a population demanding dignity and self-determination. The revolution revealed with brutal clarity that reform within the system would be tolerated only so long as it did not threaten the geopolitical architecture built after the Second World War, and that when popular aspiration collided with strategic necessity, tanks would decide the outcome. Yet this clarity carried its own power, stripping away illusions and forcing both rulers and the ruled to confront the true nature of the order imposed upon them, an understanding that would quietly reshape political behavior for decades. In Hungary, the memory of 1956 endured beneath the enforced calm of normalization, shaping a society that learned to survive through caution and compromise while never fully accepting the legitimacy of imposed rule, ensuring that loyalty remained conditional and belief fragile. Across Eastern Europe, the revolution became a reference point, a warning of the costs of defiance, but also a proof that mass resistance was possible, informing later movements that sought change through endurance, negotiation, and international pressure rather than open revolt. For the Soviet Union, Hungary was both a demonstration of power and a revelation of vulnerability, as the need to intervene exposed the insecurity of a system that could not tolerate deviation without risking collapse, reinforcing a cycle of rigidity that would later undermine its capacity to adapt. Internationally, the events of 1956 reshaped Cold War realism, tempering expectations of liberation with acceptance of limits, and embedding a cautious pragmatism in Western policy that prioritized stability over confrontation, even as it absorbed the moral cost of inaction. When the Cold War finally ended, the Hungarian Revolution was reclaimed not as a failed rebellion, but as an early assertion of the principles that would ultimately prevail. Its sacrifice acknowledged as part of a longer struggle whose resolution lay decades beyond the moment of defeat. The revolution's enduring significance rests in this transformation of loss into legacy, as the courage displayed in 1956 helped define the moral boundaries of the Cold War and illuminated the price paid by those who challenged empire before the conditions for success had fully emerged. In remembering Hungary, the Cold War is revealed not only as a contest of power, but as a human drama in which ordinary people confronted extraordinary forces, altering history not by winning, but by exposing truths that power could suppress only temporarily.